We are just moments away from learning the Federal Reserve's decision regarding interest rate cuts. Experts are projecting rates will remain unchanged for the third time this year. The markets are responding in anticipation of the decision. Right now, the Dow up about 200 points. And I just heard in my ear from our EP, Adam, rates are steady. So rates will be unchanged at that 4.25 to 4.5 benchmark rate. Let's tell you about the S&P and tech-heavy NASDAQ. Those are relatively flat. So while today's announcement is the third of the year, it is the second Fed decision since President Trump took office in January. The central bank keeping the benchmark rate again, as I mentioned, at 4.25 to 4.5% as it presses forward with its 2% inflation goal. The decision to hold steady, defying calls from the president, who has been asking the central bank to make cuts. Let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady, who joins us from the New York Stock Exchange. She had been reading the tea leaves and told us for days that this would be the decision. Here we are. What does this mean for the markets?
So likely you're not going to see a huge jump either way in the markets right now. And I'm actually sort of keeping an eye on it over here. We've been up. We're not seeing a huge change. Where you could see markets really move is when Fed Chair Powell starts speaking at 2:30. He's going to face questions. He's going to give a statement. He's going to give information on what led to this decision to hold interest rates steady. And that really is going to be where investors are looking for information. How many cuts will we get in the future? Will we get any this year? When you think about what this impacts for folks at home, though, mortgage rates, car loans, you're likely going to see things elevated higher for longer. Those are driven by bond yields, treasury yields. And when you get a decision like this, investors think, okay, interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, and that's what keeps that treasury yield elevated.
And so who are the winners and losers of interest rates remaining unchanged?
So, look, the consumer is sort of the loser in the short run, because you and I have talked about this all the time, right? We want to be able to go out and buy a house, and we want those mortgage rates to come down. When you think about the long run, though, you don't want a situation where inflation creeps up and the Fed has already cut interest rates. And the reason why inflation could creep up is because of the impact of these tariffs. And then they're sort of in a situation where they have to raise interest rates. That would be bad for consumers. The loser in terms of keeping interest rates higher for longer is also the government. Remember, we've got a ton of government debt. The interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets goes into how much the government pays on their debt. An interest rate is a huge expense, so the government wants to see the interest rate go down.
So what are some of the questions that you think the chair is going to face this afternoon?
How much of an impact is tariffs having on your outlook? I think that's probably the number one question. Do you see inflation going higher and economic growth slowing down? We've talked about stagflation a ton. Chair Powell is really going to hear a lot of pushback from reporters saying, hey, we just had a negative quarter of GDP. How is that factoring into your thought process? We'll also likely expect for him to get a question about all of this back and forth with the president. We have heard pressure from the president to lower interest rates, though he has backed off of those comments, calling for Chair Powell to step down. Powell tends to be pretty tight-lipped when it comes to these things, so we likely won't get much of an answer there.
Okay, Kelly O'Grady, thank you as always. Joining us now for more on this is CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia. Jiang, Weijia, we know the president has been calling for the Fed chair to cut rates. So has Treasury Secretary Bessent. Do we expect the White House to make a statement on this today?
I'm sure that they will be making a statement, Lindsay, because to your point, the president has been very vocal in expressing his frustration with the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell for not cutting those rates. In fact, at one point, he even said that he believed it was a political move by Powell not to do so. And so we are anticipating, I was actually just checking to make sure I didn't miss a post from the president in reaction to this, Lindsay. But I will say he has scaled back sort of the tone of his remarks, because at one point he seemed to be suggesting the idea, or at least toying with the idea of removing Powell. But his advisors, just like they did when he did that during the first term, warned him that that could really impact the markets negatively. And since then, the president has publicly said he never intended to fire Jerome Powell over this, but he maintained that he believed that the interest rate should be cut.
And we know that top Trump administration officials are set to meet with their Chinese counterparts in Switzerland this weekend to talk trade. This is news after we've been hearing, are they or aren't they talking? What could these talks look like?
Well, the president just made remarks in the Oval Office, Lindsay, that really set up a complicated environment for those talks between Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and the top trade official Jamieson Greer, who are meeting with their counterparts later this week, as you mentioned, in Switzerland, because the president says that he will not, that's a big no, he said, reduce the tariffs that are currently on China, which, as we have been reporting extensively, is 145%, in order to get them to the negotiating table to craft a new deal. Beijing has said they are willing to entertain new talks if the tariffs come down. And so they already seem to be at a standstill even before these talks are even happening, Lindsay. So, I mean, there is a chance that Beijing hears what the president just said and revisits their decision to meet with the U.S. over this. We just don't know because, again, he just made those remarks in the Oval. We should also mention that the president basically said, look, China needs us more than we need them. He says we are no longer losing anything because the playing field is now equal with these tariffs. And so the president seemed to indicate that he believes the U.S. has a lot more to, that China has a lot more to lose here than America.
Okay, Weijia Jiang, thank you so much.
Sure.